In my grandmother's house, there were two sacred books. One was the Holy Bible. The other was Emily Post's Etiquette. And my grandmother would quote from both. "Judge not, that ye be not judged," she would warn, from the Gospel according to Matthew. "Always rise when a lady enters the room," she would say, from the Gospel according to Emily. I remember looking at that book when I was at her house. It was huge, bigger than the Bible, and with a lot more rules. There were rules about writing thank you notes to people who had given gifts, and rules about not slurping your soup when you ate with a spoon, and always rules about how to give a dinner party. Listen to this excerpt from the original 1922 edition. "When Mrs. Worldly gives a dinner, it means no effort on her part whatsoever beyond deciding upon the date and the principal guest who are to form the nucleus. Every further detail is left to her subordinates. On the morning of the dinner, her secretary brings her the place cards, and she puts them in the order in which they are to be placed on the table, very much as though playing solitaire. Starting with her own card at one end and her husband's at the other, she first places the lady of honor on his right, the second in importance on his left. Then on either side of herself, she puts the two most important gentlemen. The others she fits in between, trying to seat side by side those congenial to each other. And then, of course, the butler puts the cards on the table. Isn't that just how you do it at your house? It's a shame that the host in today's gospel lesson didn't have the benefit of Emily Post's wisdom. If he had, he might have saved himself and his guest considerable embarrassment just by putting a few place cards on the table. But he didn't, which left the guest scrambling for the seat of honor and Jesus interjecting with some rules of etiquette. If only there had been place cards. Place cards. But there weren't. You might think that what we have here in the gospel is just some rules about how to take your seat at a dinner table, something you might find in Emily Post. And since we have place cards these days, you might think it's not all that important, that this is a section you could leave out of the gospel altogether. Maybe there could just be a blank place there for you to write in your own rules. Always write thank you notes. Never slurp your soup. But Luke tells us that these are not rules of etiquette Jesus is laying out. This is a parable he is telling. And like all parables, it gives us a glimpse of the kingdom. It shows us something about the Father's heart. So let's take a closer look. This reading begins with the notice that Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees on the Sabbath, and they were watching him closely. That is, the Pharisees were watching him closely because Jesus was a notorious breaker of the Sabbath laws, and the Pharisees were notorious keepers of the Sabbath laws. Already in this gospel, Jesus' disciples have plucked heads of grain on the Sabbath and eaten them. Jesus has healed a man with a withered hand and straightened a woman's bent-over back. There's no telling what this man might do on the Sabbath day. The Pharisees are watching him. But Luke says he was also watching them closely. He watched how they took their seats at the banquet, and he especially noticed how they chose the places of honor. Now let me say just a word about that. In the time and place Jesus lived, honor was everything. People didn't have very much, but what they had was their social standing in the community. Everything they did or said threatened to raise or lower that standing. And so they had to be careful. If somebody's daughter was engaged to a nice young man with good prospects, that person's standing went up in the community. But if she got pregnant before she was married, his standing went down, way down. It's really not all that different these days where we live, is it? The gossip network is alive and well. We all seem to know who has gotten a big promotion recently or who has suffered public shame. In the small villages where Jesus was in those days, everybody would know who should sit at the place of honor at a banquet, just as they knew who should sit in the lowest place. Sometimes then, as now, people get a little confused about their own importance, and someone takes a seat at a higher level than he has earned. So Jesus says to the guest at this banquet, when you are invited by someone to a fancy meal, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who has invited both of you may come to you and say, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. For the people Jesus was talking to, nothing could have been much more disgraceful than that, having to stand up at a banquet and be ushered to the lowest place, the seat of shame at that meal. They must have cringed at the very idea. The advice that Jesus gives here, however, could lead to another kind of problem. He says, but when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. Fred Craddock says this passage could very easily turn into a cartoon, where everybody is at first scrambling for the places of honor, and then Jesus gives them some advice, and they all stop, turn, and scramble for the lowest seat at the table, sitting on each other's laps until their host comes along to usher them to a better, higher place. I don't think that kind of false humility is what Jesus has in mind, although you do sometimes see this among his followers. The pastor or the deacon chairman who will say, no, really, that's fine. I'll just sit over here in the corner next to the potted plant. It doesn't matter, not to me.